The guards didn't recognize her. Deborah Gordon stood at the iron gates of the Bracewell mansion, her fingers trembling against the cold metal. The security guard looked her up and down with thinly veiled contempt, taking in her simple black dress, the faint scars still visible on her forearms from where glass had torn through skin. "Mr. Bracewell doesn't see charity cases," the taller guard said, his hand already moving toward his radio. "You need to move along." She didn't move, couldn't move. Beyond those gates, through the manicured gardens, and past the fountain that cost more than most people's houses, Mark was inside. The man who had promised her forever. The man who had kissed her forehead 2 days before the accident and whispered that she was his last love, his only love. The woman he wanted to grow old beside. The man who had married someone else while she was still learning to walk again. "I'm not leaving," Deborah said quietly. Her voice didn't shake. That surprised her. The second guard stepped closer, his face hardening. "Listen, lady, I don't know what you think." The purr of a Bentley engine cut through his words. Deborah turned as the sleek black car glided to a stop behind her. The door opened, and Lydia Trentworth emerged, diamonds glittering at her throat, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. Lydia had been on the museum board with Deborah's mother for 30 years. She'd known Deborah since she was in diapers. Lydia's face went pale, then red, then something between fury and disbelief. "You absolute idiots," Lydia said, her voice cutting through the evening air like a blade. She walked straight up to the guards, who suddenly looked less certain. "Do you have any idea who you're stopping?" The taller guard opened his mouth. Lydia cut him off. "This is Deborah Harrington Gordon. The Harrington Gordons. Her family built half of Manhattan. Her mother controls more media than you've consumed in your entire lives. Her grandfather's name is on the hospital where you were probably born." Lydia's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Step aside before you lose more than your jobs." The gates swung open. Deborah walked through without looking at the guards, but she heard one of them whisper into his radio. "We have a situation." Yes, Deborah thought, you certainly do. The mansion doors stood open. Music and laughter spilled out into the twilight. Deborah stepped inside, and the world seemed to slow down, sounds becoming muffled, everything crystallizing into sharp, painful focus. The engagement party was in full swing. Crystal chandeliers threw light across marble floors. Women in designer gowns clustered around champagne fountains. Men in expensive suits discussed deals and golf handicaps. And in the center of it all, standing beneath an archway wrapped in white roses, stood Mark Bracewell. He looked good, rested, happy. A woman stood beside him, her hand possessive on his arm. She was showing off a ring to a cluster of admirers, a diamond so large it caught the light with every gesture. Cindy Wood, pretty in that carefully constructed way, her laugh just a little too loud, her smile just a little too perfect. Deborah stood in the doorway, and slowly, inevitably, the room began to notice her. Conversations faltered, heads turned, someone gasped. Mark looked up. Their eyes met across the ballroom, and Deborah watched his face drain of color. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came out. Beside him, Cindy frowned, confused by the sudden silence, by the way every eye in the room had shifted to track a woman in a simple black dress who didn't belong. Deborah walked. Her heels clicked against marble. No one spoke. No one moved. They just watched as she crossed that floor, her chin high, her hands steady at her sides. She'd practiced this moment in her head 1,000 times during physical therapy, during the nights when she couldn't sleep, during the hours she spent staring at wedding photos on social media that made her want to scream. She stopped in front of Mark. Up close, she could see the tiny details. The way his tie was crooked, because he never could get it right without help. The aftershave that she used to love. The eyes that had once looked at her like she was everything. "Deborah," he whispered, "I didn't know you were—" Her hand connected with his face. The slap echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Mark's head snapped to the side, and a red handprint bloomed across his cheek. Cindy shrieked. Someone dropped a glass. Deborah didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, letting him see everything in her eyes. The pain, the betrayal, the 7 weeks she spent in a hospital bed, calling him, texting him, begging for just one word. The day his assistant had finally answered and told her, in a voice dripping with false sympathy, that Mr. Bracewell had moved forward, and she should too. The wedding invitation that had arrived while she was still using a walker. "You promised," Deborah said softly, "that I was your last love." Then she turned around and walked back toward the door. Behind her, Mark found his voice. "Wait, please, I can explain." The roar of engines drowned out his words. Through the open doors, Deborah could see them arriving in perfect formation. 10 Rolls-Royces, gleaming black under the streetlights, pulling up one after another like a precision military operation. Drivers emerged and opened doors, and from each car stepped members of Deborah's family. Her mother, Sylviane Harrington Gordon, elegant and terrifying in cream silk. Her uncle Richard, who sat on the boards of 6 Fortune 500 companies. Her cousin Marcus, whose hedge fund moved markets. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all of them wearing the same expression. Cold fury barely contained beneath polished manners. They'd come because Lydia had called them, because one of their own had been humiliated, and the Harrington Gordons did not tolerate such things. Deborah walked past her family without stopping. Her mother's hand brushed her shoulder, a brief touch that conveyed more than words could. "We've got you. We'll handle this. You never have to see him again." Behind her, she heard Lydia Trentworth's voice ring out, sharp and clear. "You just declared war on the wrong family, Mr. Bracewell. I hope she was worth it." Deborah climbed into her mother's Rolls-Royce. The door closed, sealing out the chaos. Through tinted windows, she watched Mark stand on his front steps, Cindy clutching his arm, as Manhattan's most powerful family drove away, in a procession that looked like a funeral. His funeral, she thought. He just doesn't know it yet. The car glided through the streets. Deborah leaned her head back against leather seats and closed her eyes. Her hand still stung from the slap. "Tell me what you need," her mother said quietly. Deborah opened her eyes. In the rearview mirror, she could see the mansion growing smaller, the lights and music fading into the distance. Mark was back there, probably trying to explain to his guests what had just happened, probably trying to figure out who Deborah Gordon really was. He was about to find out. "I need him to understand what he threw away," Deborah said. Her voice was steady now. "All the tears cried out during 7 weeks in a hospital where he never came. I need him to lose everything he thought was important, and I need him to know every single day that he did this to himself." Her mother nodded once. "Consider it done." As they drove through Manhattan, past buildings the Harrington Gordons owned, past businesses they controlled, past lives they could change with a single phone call, Deborah made herself a promise. Mark Bracewell had loved her when he thought she was nobody. He'd run when things got hard, when she needed him most, when real love required courage instead of romance. Now he was going to learn what it meant to be on the wrong side of the family he'd dismissed as trust fund babies. He was going to watch his carefully constructed world crumble piece by piece, and when he had nothing left, when he finally understood what real loss felt like, maybe then he'd comprehend the magnitude of what he'd done. Deborah looked down at her hands. The scars from the accident were still visible, pale lines against her skin. She used to try to hide them, not anymore. Scars meant you survived, and Deborah Gordon was done just surviving. It was time to rise. Chapter 2. Before she was broken. The gallery had been quiet that afternoon. Deborah remembered it perfectly, the way she remembered everything about the day her life divided into before and after. Sunlight streaming through tall windows, catching dust motes in golden shafts, the smell of fresh paint from the restoration work happening in the back room, the soft classical music playing just loud enough to fill the silence without overwhelming it. She'd been adjusting a painting, some modern piece that she personally found pretentious but that collectors would pay obscene amounts for, when the door chimed. The man who walked in looked uncomfortable. He was dressed well, expensive suit tailored perfectly to his frame, but he moved through the gallery like someone navigating a minefield. His eyes darted from painting to painting with an expression that said he'd rather be anywhere else. Deborah had seen the type before. Wealthy men who came to galleries because they thought they should, because owning art was what successful people did, even if they couldn't tell a Rothko from a paint-by-numbers kit. "Can I help you?" she'd asked, keeping her voice professional and distant. He'd turned, and something in his face had surprised her. Not arrogance, which she'd expected. Honesty. "I'm completely lost," he said, gesturing helplessly at the paintings surrounding them. "My business partner said I needed to start collecting art, said it was good for my image, but I don't understand any of this." Most men in his position would have faked it, would have nodded knowingly at paintings they didn't comprehend and dropped names of artists they'd Googled that morning. This man just admitted defeat. "What's your name?" Deborah had asked. Mark Bracewell." She'd heard the name. Young tech entrepreneur, built his company from nothing, the kind of success story that business magazines loved, self-made, proud of it. "Okay, Mark, let me show you something." She'd led him to a smaller piece in the corner, a landscape that most people walked past without noticing. "What do you see?" He'd studied it seriously, giving her question real consideration. "Trees, a river. Looks peaceful, I guess." "And how does it make you feel?" "Like I want to be there. Like that's the kind of place where you could breathe." Deborah had smiled. "Then that's what art is. Forget what you're supposed to like. Forget impressing anyone. If something makes you want to step into it, if it makes you feel something real, that's all that matters." They'd spent 3 hours together that afternoon. Mark asked questions, actual questions, not the pretentious nonsense she usually heard. He admitted when he didn't understand something. He laughed at himself when he mixed up styles. And when he finally left, he turned back at the door. "I'm Mark, by the way. I know I said that already, but I realized I never asked your name." "Deborah," she'd said. Just Deborah. Not Deborah Harrington Gordon, not the heiress whose trust fund could buy the entire gallery 10 times over. Just Deborah. "Can I come back?" he'd asked. "To learn more about art?" She'd known even then that art was just the excuse, but she'd said yes anyway. That was 9 months before the accident. 9 months of falling in love with a man who saw her as real, as earned, as someone who worked at a gallery and split checks at dinner and argued with him about tipping waiters too little. 9 months of almost telling him the truth about who she really was, about the family name she carried, about the fact that she didn't need to work at the gallery because her family owned half of the building it was in. But every time she got close, Mark would say something about trust fund babies or people who never built anything themselves, and the words would stick in her throat. He respected her because he thought they were equals. He loved her because he believed she understood what it meant to earn your place in the world. How could she tell him that everything he thought he knew about her was a carefully constructed omission? 6 months into their relationship, they'd been walking through Central Park when Mark had stopped suddenly, pulling her to face him. "I need to tell you something," he'd said, and his hands had been shaking. "I've dated before, plenty of times, but they always wanted something. The success story, the guy who built a company from nothing. They loved the idea of me, not the actual me. Mark, you yelled at me for undertipping. You split the check on our first 5 dates. You told me my taste in music was terrible." He'd laughed, but there were tears in his eyes. "You're real, Deborah. You see me, the actual me. And I need you to know that you're the last woman I'm ever going to love. Not because I'm settling, because I can't imagine wanting anyone else." Deborah had kissed him then, tasting salt from tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "I love you too," she'd whispered against his mouth. "Tomorrow," she'd told herself, "tomorrow I'll tell him everything. Tomorrow he'll understand that I kept this secret because I wanted him to know the real me too, before the name complicated everything." But she'd waited. Days became weeks, became months. The longer she waited, the harder it became to find the right words. And then Mark had proposed. Small Italian restaurant, the kind with red checkered tablecloths and candles stuck in wine bottles. The pasta had been perfect. The wine had been cheap. Mark had been so nervous that he'd knocked over his water glass twice. "I'm not good at speeches," he'd said, pulling out a small velvet box. "But I know what I want. I want to spend every day with you. I want to argue about modern art that we both secretly think is terrible. I want to grow old with someone who makes me better just by existing." The ring had been simple, beautiful in its simplicity. Not the massive diamond a Harrington Gordon heiress would be expected to wear, but perfect for Deborah, the gallery worker, Deborah the woman who split checks, Deborah the real person he thought he knew. "Yes," she'd said, because she couldn't imagine saying anything else. They'd celebrated with cheap champagne and gone back to her apartment, the modest one-bedroom she kept for exactly this reason, for maintaining the life she'd built separate from her family. And while Mark slept beside her, Deborah had made a plan. Tomorrow. She'd go tomorrow to the family estate, get her grandmother's ring from the vault, an heirloom worth more than Mark's company, a piece of history that would finally reveal who she really was. She'd bring it back, show him, explain everything. He'd understand. He had to understand. The next evening, Deborah had driven out to the estate. The security guard had waved her through without question. The vault had been opened by her mother's assistant, who'd carefully retrieved the ring box and handed it over with white gloves. Deborah had held that box, feeling the weight of truth in her hands. She'd imagined Mark's face when she opened it, the questions, the conversation they'd finally have. Maybe he'd be angry at first, but then he'd understand. He'd see that she'd wanted to be real for him, wanted to be loved for herself before the name changed everything. She'd been smiling when she got back in her car. She'd been thinking about their future when the drunk driver ran the red light. She'd been reaching for her phone to call Mark when the world exploded into glass and metal and screaming. The last thought Deborah had before everything went black was simple and devastating. "I never told him." When she woke up 7 days later, machines beeping around her, pain radiating through every nerve, her mother sitting beside the hospital bed with red eyes, the first words out of Deborah's mouth were, "Where's Mark?" Her mother's face had said everything. "He came once," Sylviane said quietly. "The first day you were here, you were unconscious. He looked at you, at the machines, the injuries, everything, and I saw him break. Not with grief, Deborah, with fear. He left after 20 minutes. He hasn't been back." Deborah had closed her eyes. "Call him, please. Tell him I'm awake. Tell him I need him." Her mother had made the call. Then another, then another. Mark never answered. Deborah spent 7 weeks in that hospital. 7 weeks of surgery and physical therapy and learning to walk properly again. 7 weeks of calling Mark's phone and hearing it ring into voicemail. 7 weeks of watching her mother's face grow harder every day as the man who'd promised forever chose to disappear instead. And then the wedding invitation had arrived. Cream paper, elegant script, the kind of formal announcement that rich people sent when they wanted everyone to know about their happiness. "Mark Bracewell and Cindy Wood request the honor of your presence at their wedding." 5 weeks. He'd waited 5 weeks after her accident to marry someone else. Deborah had been in physical therapy when she'd opened it, standing at the parallel bars, trying to remember how legs were supposed to work. The therapist had caught her before she hit the ground. "I need to see it," Deborah had told her mother that night. "I need to see him marry her." "Deborah, no. I need to see what I meant to him. I need to see it with my own eyes." So she'd gone. Stood across the street from the venue, hidden among tourists and street vendors, and watched through the windows as Mark Bracewell married Cindy Wood. The ceremony had been small, intimate. Mark had looked exhausted, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Cindy had looked triumphant, like someone who'd just won a prize. And Deborah had stood there, still using a cane, still wearing compression bandages under her clothes, and made a decision. If Mark Bracewell wanted to walk away from her when she needed him most, fine. If he wanted to marry some woman he barely knew instead of fighting for the relationship he'd claimed was forever, fine. But he was going to learn what he'd thrown away. He was going to discover exactly who Deborah Gordon really was. And when his world crumbled, when everything he'd built came apart in his hands, he'd know that he'd done it to himself. Deborah had gone home that night and called her mother. "I'm ready," she'd said. "Tell the family, it's time." And in that moment, Mark Bracewell's fate was sealed. Chapter 3. The Hospital Where Love Died. The first time Mark visited, Deborah had still been unconscious. She wouldn't know this until later, until her mother finally told her the full story, until the private investigator she'd hired pulled hospital security footage and had a professional reconstruct exactly what had happened during those 7 weeks when her life hung in the balance. But it was important. The details mattered, because Mark would later claim he'd tried, that he'd wanted to be there, that circumstances had pulled him away. The footage told a different story. Day 1. Mark had arrived at the hospital 6 hours after the accident, still wearing the same clothes from that morning. He'd looked shocked, shaken, like someone moving through a nightmare. Deborah's mother had met him in the hallway outside the ICU. The lip reader who analyzed the footage captured their conversation word for word. "How is she?" Mark had asked. "Critical. They don't know if she'll survive the night." Mark had swayed on his feet. Sylviane had reached out to steady him, and for a moment compassion had softened her face. This was her daughter's choice, after all, the man Deborah loved. Surely he'd be strong enough to stand beside her through this. "Can I see her?" They'd let him in. 5 minutes. That was all the ICU allowed. Mark had stood beside Deborah's bed looking at her face, swollen, bruised, barely recognizable, at the breathing tube, at the machines keeping her alive, at the future he'd proposed to, broken and uncertain. The security camera captured him backing away, captured the fear in his eyes, captured the moment he turned and left. "I can't," he'd said to Sylviane in the hallway. "I'm sorry, I can't do this." "She needs you," Sylviane had said, her voice hardening. "Mark, she's going to survive. The doctors say her prognosis is good, but she needs to know you're here. She needs—" "I'm sorry," he'd repeated. And then he'd left. He'd gone to the parking lot, sat in his car for 20 minutes, hands shaking on the steering wheel. And then someone had gotten into the passenger seat. Cindy Wood. The investigator had tracked her down later, found out that she'd been waiting at a nearby coffee shop, found out that Mark had called her after leaving the ICU, told her he needed someone to talk to, needed someone to help him process what he'd just seen. Cindy had been ready. She'd been planning this for weeks, ever since she'd learned about Deborah's accident through the extensive gossip network that wealthy people maintained. She'd seen an opportunity and positioned herself perfectly to catch Mark when he fell. The footage showed them talking, showed Cindy's hand on Mark's arm, her face sympathetic, her voice captured faintly by the parking lot microphones, saying exactly what a frightened man needed to hear. "You can't help her by destroying yourself. Mark, what if she's not the same? What if there's permanent damage? You have a company to run. You have responsibilities. You can't put your life on hold indefinitely." Mark had nodded, had believed her, had driven away from that hospital thinking he was being practical, being realistic, being mature about an impossible situation. He'd never come back. Deborah had woken up a week later. She'd asked for him immediately, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd only just removed. Her mother had tried to soften it, had tried to prepare her, but there was no gentle way to say, "The man you love abandoned you." "Call him," Deborah had whispered. "Please, Mom, just call him. He doesn't know I'm awake yet." Sylviane had made the call. Mark's phone had rung and rung. Finally, someone answered. Mr. Bracewell's office. Not Mark, his assistant, a woman named Patricia who Deborah had met exactly once and who'd looked at her like she was staff. "This is Sylviane Harrington Gordon. I need to speak with Mark immediately. It's about Deborah. Mr. Bracewell is unavailable. This is urgent. Deborah is awake. She's asking for him." A pause, then, I'll pass along the message. But the message never reached Mark, or if it did, he chose not to respond. Deborah called herself the next day using the hospital phone, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely dial. Mark's personal cell, the one he'd given her on their third date with the instruction to call any time for anything. It rang straight to voicemail. She tried again an hour later. Voicemail. She tried texting. No response. She tried his office line. Patricia answered again, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Miss Gordon, I've been instructed to inform you that Mr. Bracewell has moved forward with his life. He wishes you a full recovery, but he's asked that you stop attempting to contact him. The words had hit like a physical blow. Deborah had dropped the phone. A nurse had found her 10 minutes later, curled around herself in the hospital bed, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. That was week 2. By week 3, Deborah was in physical therapy. The accident had shattered her left leg, fractured her pelvis, caused internal bleeding that required 2 surgeries to repair. The doctor said she was lucky to be alive. The physical therapist said she'd walk again, but it would take time, patience, and work. Deborah worked like her life depended on it, pushed through pain that made her scream, forced her body to remember how to do things that had been automatic before. And while she worked, she called Mark. Every day, sometimes multiple times, he never answered. Week 4, Deborah's mother brought clothes from her apartment. In the pocket of her jacket was a business card. Cindy Wood, it read, event coordinator. I found this, Sylviane said quietly. It was in Mark's office when I went to retrieve some of your things you'd left there. Cindy Wood. She's the wife of Mark's business partner. Except what? They're getting divorced. The partner and Cindy. The papers were filed 3 days after your accident. Deborah had stared at that business card. Something cold had settled in her chest, something that felt like understanding. She was waiting, Deborah said. She knew about me. She knew about us. And when I got hurt... Her mother had nodded grimly. Your investigator is pulling more details, but it seems Miss Wood has been positioning herself very carefully for some time. Week 5, the wedding invitation arrived. It was Lydia Trentworth who brought it, her face twisted with fury and disgust. She'd been copied on the invitation list because she sat on boards with everyone who mattered in Manhattan. She'd brought it straight to the hospital, needing Deborah to see it, to understand. I tried to talk to him, Lydia had said, pacing in Deborah's hospital room like a caged tiger. I cornered him at his office yesterday, asked him what the hell he thought he was doing. Do you know what he said? Deborah had shaken her head, not trusting her voice. He said you deserved someone better. Said he wasn't strong enough for what you needed. Said Cindy understood him in ways you never did. Lydia had stopped pacing, her voice dropping. He doesn't know who you are, does he? He thinks you're just some girl who worked at a gallery. I never told him. Why? Deborah had looked down at her hands, at the IV still taped to her skin. Because I wanted him to love me for me, just me. Not the name, not the money, not the connections. I wanted something real. Oh, darling, Lydia had said, sitting on the edge of the hospital bed. It was real, but real doesn't always mean lasting. Real doesn't always mean strong enough. Week 6, Deborah had been moved to a regular room. She could walk with a walker, could manage most things herself. The doctors were talking about discharge. One afternoon, her mother arrived with a laptop. I need to show you something, Sylviane had said. The investigator finished his report. They'd watched the parking lot footage together, watched Mark sit in his car while Cindy poisoned his mind, watched the security tapes from the coffee shop where they'd met 3 more times that first week. Watched as Cindy carefully, methodically convinced Mark that staying with Deborah was impossible, that she deserved better, that moving on was the kindest thing he could do. The lip reader had caught one particular conversation 2 days before Deborah woke up. She's going to need months of recovery, Cindy had said. Maybe years. You'll spend your whole life taking care of someone who reminds you every day of this tragedy. Is that what you want? Or do you want a fresh start, Mark? A chance to be happy without guilt? And Mark, broken and scared, had said, I want to be happy. Deborah had closed the laptop, sat in silence for a long time. What do you want to do? Her mother had asked. I want to go to the wedding. Deborah, I need to see it. I need to see what I'm worth to him. I need to know if he even looks guilty, or if Cindy has convinced him that abandoning me was actually noble. Week 7, Deborah had been discharged. She'd gone home to her real apartment, not the modest one she'd maintained for Mark, but the penthouse in the building her family owned, the space that reflected who she actually was. She'd stood at the window that night, looking out over a city her family had helped build, and made herself a promise. Mark wanted to believe that leaving her was merciful. Cindy wanted to believe she'd won. They were both about to learn how wrong they were. The day of Mark's wedding, Deborah had stood across the street and watched him marry a woman he barely knew, watched him say vows that he'd promised first to her, watched Cindy slip a ring on his finger that symbolized the biggest mistake of his life. And when it was over, when the small crowd of guests had left and the venue lights had gone dark, Deborah had called her mother. I'm ready. Start Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was the Harrington-Gordon family's term for systematic dismantling. It was what they did to people who hurt them, to competitors who crossed lines, to anyone foolish enough to declare war on one of the most powerful families in America. It was thorough, it was legal, it was merciless. And Mark Bracewell, who'd abandoned Deborah in a hospital, who'd married another woman while she was still learning to walk, who'd chosen comfort over courage, was about to discover exactly what Protocol 7 meant. Consider it done, her mother had said. Deborah had hung up and gone home. She'd taken a long bath, let herself cry one last time for the man she'd loved, for the life they'd planned, for the innocence she'd lost in that hospital bed when she realized love wasn't always enough. Then she'd gotten dressed, put on her armor of designer clothes and family name, and prepared for war. Mark had 4 months of happiness with Cindy before Deborah crashed his engagement party and slapped him across the face. After that, his world would fall apart one piece at a time, and Deborah would watch, unmoved, as the man who'd taught her about betrayal learned what it meant to lose everything. Chapter 4. The Investigation. The conference room in the Harrington-Gordon building overlooked Central Park from 50 stories up. Deborah sat at the head of the table, her mother on one side, her Uncle Richard on the other. Between them lay folders, thick, detailed, containing information that would destroy Mark Bracewell's life. They'd waited 4 months to open these folders. 4 months for Mark to feel secure, to believe he'd gotten away with it, to settle into his new life with Cindy. 4 months for the guilt to fade, for the memory of Deborah in a hospital bed to become something he could compartmentalize and forget. Now it was time to remind him. The investigator was very thorough, her mother said, pushing the first folder toward Deborah. You should know what you're about to do. Once we start this, there's no mercy, no stopping halfway. The Harrington-Gordon name will be attached to his destruction, and everyone will know we did it deliberately. Deborah opened the folder. The first page was a photograph of Cindy Wood, not the polished version from Mark's engagement party, but a grainier security camera shot from an underground poker room. Timestamp, 3 months before Deborah's accident. She was a regular, Uncle Richard said, his voice flat and businesslike. The kind of regular that casinos love and families worry about. She was into them for $200,000 by the time she met Mark. The next photo showed Cindy at a different poker table, then another, then bank statements showing withdrawals, credit cards maxed out, payday loans taken from increasingly desperate sources. The interesting part, her mother continued, is the timeline. Cindy became friendly with Mark's business partner 6 months before your accident. Casual at first, then strategic. She married the partner not out of love, but out of calculation. He had access to Mark, and Mark was exactly the kind of wealthy man she needed. Deborah flipped to the next section. Text messages between Cindy and someone labeled unknown contact. The investigator had traced it back to someone she owed money to, someone whose business methods existed firmly outside the law. The messages were blunt, Need more time. About to land something big. You said that last month. You're out of time, Cindy. I'm working on it, trust me. This one's worth millions. He better be real, otherwise we have a problem. Then, dated 2 days after Deborah's accident. Target's girlfriend is out of the picture. Moving in now. Deborah's hands tightened on the folder, but her voice stayed level. She researched me. Extensively. Her uncle pulled out another set of documents. Found out about your family 3 weeks before the accident. She knew exactly who you were, what you were worth, what your relationship with Mark meant in terms of social and financial elevation. And when you got hurt, she saw her window. More than that, she engineered it. Her mother's voice went cold. The hospital parking lot footage shows her meeting with Mark multiple times during your first week. The coffee shop meetings were pre-planned. She'd positioned herself as his business partner's wife, someone safe to confide in, someone who could offer sympathy without agenda. Except it was all agenda, all manipulation, all carefully calculated to catch a man when he was most vulnerable and steer him away from the woman he'd promised forever. The next section of the folder contained transcripts. The investigator had hired a professional lip reader to analyze every frame of security footage, reconstructing conversations word by word. Deborah read them in silence. Cindy's voice, that first parking lot meeting. Mark, you can't destroy yourself trying to save her. What if she's different after this? What if there's brain damage, personality changes? You could spend your whole life caring for someone who isn't the woman you fell in love with. Days later, at the coffee shop. I know you feel guilty, but guilt isn't love. You deserve someone who can meet you where you are, not someone you have to carry. A week after that. She has family. They have resources. She'll be taken care of. You staying won't change her outcome, but it will destroy yours. And finally, 3 days before the wedding. I've been thinking about you a lot, about how strong you've been through this. You're the kind of man who deserves genuine happiness, not obligation disguised as love. She's a professional, Deborah said quietly. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned. Down to the timeline, her uncle confirmed. She filed for divorce from the business partner exactly 1 week after your accident. Fast-tracked it with a lawyer who specializes in quick, clean separations. She was legally single within a month. In time to marry Mark. In time to lock him in before he figured out what was happening. Deborah closed that folder and opened the next one. This contained Mark's financials, his company structure, his investors, his business relationships, his social connections. Everything that made Mark Bracewell successful was detailed in those pages. And next to each item was a note in red ink, written in her uncle's precise handwriting. Primary investor, Rothmore Capital, 40% owned by HG Holdings. Headquarters lease, Morrison Building, HG Property Subsidiary. Tech patents, licensed from Ashford University, HG Foundation major donor. Banking, Sterling Private Wealth, HG family sits on board. On and on it went. Every piece of Mark's carefully constructed empire touched in some way the Harrington-Gordon family. Not directly enough that he'd ever noticed, not obviously enough that it looked like influence, but substantially enough that if that influence was withdrawn, if those connections were severed, if the invisible web of support that propped up every successful person in Manhattan suddenly vanished, Mark's world would collapse. He doesn't know yet, her mother said. He thinks he built everything himself. He's proud of being self-made. That pride is what made him look down on inherited wealth, what made him dismiss trust fund babies as lesser. That pride, Uncle Richard added, is what's going to make this hurt. Deborah looked at the final folder. This one was thinner. Just a few pages. What's this? Your exit strategy, her mother said. If you want to stop. If, after seeing all of this, you decide mercy is better than justice, we can make all of this disappear. Mark never has to know we investigated him. Cindy never has to know we found her secrets. You can walk away and rebuild your life without looking back. Deborah sat with that option, felt its weight, understood that her family was giving her a choice, not pushing her toward revenge. She thought about Mark in that hospital parking lot, too scared to come back inside. Thought about him marrying Cindy while Deborah was still learning to walk. Thought about the wedding invitation, the casual cruelty of it, the way he'd moved on, as if their love had been nothing. She thought about standing at his engagement party, about the moment before she slapped him, when their eyes had met, and she'd seen no remorse, no guilt, no recognition of what he'd done. Just fear, just the scrambling realization that he'd made a terrible mistake. "Start the protocol," Deborah said, "all of it. But slowly. I want him to feel every piece fall away. I want him to have time to understand what's happening and why. I want him to know at the end that he did this to himself." Her mother nodded once. "Then it begins." Over the next hour, they mapped out the strategy, which investors to contact first, how to frame the withdrawal of support, what social circles to freeze him out of systematically, how to make every setback look natural, like the inevitable consequence of poor business decisions rather than coordinated attack. "He'll suspect eventually," Uncle Richard warned. "Once enough pieces fall, he'll put it together." "Good," Deborah said. "I want him to know. I want him to lie awake at night, understanding exactly who he abandoned, exactly what family he dismissed as irrelevant, exactly how thoroughly he destroyed his own future." They finalized the plan as the sun set over Central Park. Deborah stood at the window, looking down at the city spread below her, the buildings her family owned, the businesses they controlled, the invisible empire that most people never knew existed. Mark had loved her when he thought she was nobody, had promised her forever when he believed they were equals, had run the moment that promise required sacrifice. Now he was going to learn what nobody meant, what powerless meant, what it felt like to be on the receiving end of abandonment. Deborah's phone buzzed, a text from Lydia Trentworth. "The invitations are printed. His engagement party is in 3 weeks. The entire city will be there." Deborah typed back, "I'll be there too. You're sure? I want him to see my face before it all falls apart. I want him to know it's coming." "You're your mother's daughter." Deborah smiled without humor. "No, I'm my own woman, and I'm done being invisible." She left the conference room that night with copies of every folder, every piece of evidence, every strategic move planned for the coming months. She drove home to her penthouse, poured herself wine she didn't drink, and stood at her own window overlooking her own version of the city. Mark was out there somewhere, probably home with Cindy, probably happy, probably convinced he'd dodged a bullet by leaving Deborah behind. He had 3 more weeks of that happiness. Then Deborah would walk into his engagement party, slap him across the face in front of everyone who mattered, and watch as the first domino fell. After that, it was just a matter of time. And time was something Deborah had learned during 7 weeks in a hospital was the most devastating weapon of all. Chapter 5. When Brothers Turn Away. The first domino fell exactly 3 days after the slap. Mark's assistant brought him the news during his morning meeting with potential investors from Singapore. The email was short, almost casual in its brutality. "Dear Mr. Bracewell, after careful consideration of our portfolio strategy, Rothmore Capital has decided to discontinue our partnership with your company. This decision is final. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." Mark had read it twice, certain he'd misunderstood. Rothmore Capital was his primary investor. 40% of his funding came from them. They'd been enthusiastic about his next product launch, had talked about doubling their investment, had praised his vision just 3 weeks earlier. "Get David on the phone," Mark told his assistant. David Rothmore, the firm's managing partner, the man who'd personally recruited Mark 5 years ago. "He's not taking calls." "What do you mean he's not taking calls?" His assistant said he's unavailable indefinitely. "For you." Mark had stood there in his conference room, the Singapore investors looking uncomfortable, and felt the first tremor of something he couldn't name. Not fear yet, just unease. "Excuse me," he'd said to the investors. "I need to handle this personally." He'd called David himself. The call went to voicemail. He'd tried again, same result. He'd driven to Rothmore's office, demanded to see David, and been met by security who politely but firmly escorted him from the building. "Mr. Rothmore has nothing further to discuss with you," the security guard had said. "I'm a client. I have a right." "Not anymore." That was Tuesday. By Friday, Mark knew something was terribly wrong. 2 more investors pulled out with the same vague language about portfolio strategy. His headquarters lease renewal, which had been automatic for 3 years, was suddenly under review. The bank called to discuss restructuring his credit lines. He'd tried to reach out to his network, the web of connections that successful people in Manhattan maintained like oxygen, but phone calls went unreturned. Lunch invitations were declined. People who'd been friendly a week ago were suddenly too busy to meet. Mark stood in his office that Friday evening, looking at his calendar of cancelled meetings, and finally understood. Someone was coming for him. He went home to find Cindy hosting a party he didn't know about. Their living room was full of people he didn't recognize, music blaring, laughter echoing off expensive walls. Cindy was in the center of it all, holding court like a queen, wearing a dress that cost more than his first car. "What is this?" Mark asked, pulling her aside. "A party, darling. You said I could invite friends." "I said you could have a small dinner party. This is—" He looked around at the strangers drinking his wine, eating catered food that must have cost thousands, treating his home like a nightclub. "Who are these people?" "Friends," Cindy said, already turning away. "Don't be boring, Mark. Enjoy yourself." But Mark couldn't enjoy anything. He went to his study, closed the door against the noise, and tried to figure out what was happening to his life. His phone rang. James, his best friend since college, the best man at his wedding to Cindy, the brother he'd never had by blood. "Thank God," Mark said, answering. "James, I need to talk to you about—" "I know about Deborah," James interrupted. His voice was cold. "I know who she really is. I know what you did." Mark's stomach dropped. "James, let me explain. You abandoned her in a hospital, married someone else 5 weeks later, and then I find out she's Deborah Harrington Gordon. The Harrington Gordons, Mark. Do you have any idea who that family is? What they control?" "I didn't know." "That's not the point." James's voice cracked. "The point is, you left her when she needed you most. You married Cindy before Deborah could even walk properly again. You're not the man I thought you were." "James, please, I made a mistake. I know that. I can't look at you anymore. I can't sit across from you at lunch and pretend I don't see what you really are. We're done, Mark. Don't call me again." The line went dead. Mark sat in his study while the party raged outside, holding a phone that felt like lead in his hand. James was gone. His best friend of 15 years, the person who knew him better than anyone, was just gone. The weekend was worse. Mark's younger brother Daniel had always looked up to him, always called him for advice, for help, for the kind of big brother guidance that made Mark feel like he'd succeeded at something beyond business. They had standing Sunday brunch reservations, had maintained that tradition even when life got busy. Sunday morning, Daniel didn't show up. Mark called him, no answer, texted him, no response. Finally, Mark drove to Daniel's apartment and knocked on the door until his brother answered. Daniel looked at him like he was a stranger. "Why are you here?" Daniel asked, not opening the door wider, not inviting him in. "You missed brunch. I was worried." "I didn't miss anything. I chose not to come." The words hit harder than Mark expected. "Danny, what's going on?" "Mom cries at night, did you know that? She thinks I can't hear her, but I can. She cries because her son, the one she used to brag about, the one she called her hero, turned out to be the kind of man who abandons people when things get hard." "That's not fair." "Fair?" Daniel's voice went sharp. "You want to talk about fair? Deborah Gordon was in a hospital for 7 weeks. You visited once, and then you married someone else before she could even go home. You don't get to talk to me about fair. I was scared, okay? I saw her and I didn't know what to do. So you ran, like a coward, and then you married a woman you barely knew because she made you feel better about running." Daniel stepped back, his hand on the door. "I defended you, Mark. When people asked questions, when the gossip started, I told them you must have had good reasons. But there are no good reasons. You're just weak." "Danny, don't call me that. That's what you called me when we were kids, when you were actually my brother, but my brother wouldn't do what you did. So whoever you are now, we're done." The door closed. Mark stood in the hallway of his brother's building, listening to locks turn, and felt something inside him break. That evening, Mark tried to go to his mentor's house. Lawrence Whitmore, the man who'd given Mark his first real investment, who'd taught him everything about business, who'd been like a father when Mark's own father had been absent. Lawrence wouldn't see him. Mark stood on the porch of a house he'd been welcomed into hundreds of times, and the housekeeper, a woman named Rosa, who used to make him cookies, looked at him with disappointment. "Mr. Whitmore doesn't want to see you," she said. "Rosa, please, I need to talk to him. He said if you came, I should tell you this. He taught you to be better than this. He believed you were better than this. He was wrong." She closed the door. Mark drove home in a daze. Every relationship he'd valued, every person who'd mattered was turning away, and underneath the confusion, underneath the pain, a terrible understanding was growing. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Someone had told them. Someone had made sure everyone knew the full story. Not Mark's version, not the narrative he'd constructed about impossible situations and necessary choices, but the truth, the timeline, the betrayal. Someone wanted Mark to be alone. He came home to find Cindy screaming at the housekeeper. "I don't care if the designer is unavailable," Cindy was saying, her face red, her voice shrill. "I'm Mrs. Mark Bracewell. You make it happen or you're fired." The housekeeper, a quiet woman named Maria who'd worked for Mark for 3 years, set down the phone and looked at Cindy with absolute calm. "I quit," Maria said. "You can't quit. I'm firing you." "No, I'm quitting, because I'd rather work for people with decency than stay in a house with you." Maria walked past Cindy, collected her coat and looked at Mark. "I'm sorry for whatever you're going through, Mr. Bracewell, but this woman you married, she's not worth losing your soul over." Then Maria left. Cindy threw a crystal vase at the wall. It shattered, glass exploding across marble floors, and she turned on Mark with fury in her eyes. "Are you going to let her talk to me like that?" Mark looked at Cindy, really looked at her, and saw a stranger. The woman he'd married in a fog of grief and guilt, the woman who'd seemed understanding and patient and real, was gone. Or maybe she'd never existed. Maybe this version, angry, entitled, cruel, had been hiding underneath all along. "Who are you?" Mark asked quietly. "What? Who are you really?" "Because the woman I married wouldn't treat people like that. Wouldn't scream at staff. Wouldn't throw things like a child." Cindy laughed, actually laughed. "You want to know who I really am? I'm the woman who saved you from wasting your life on damaged goods. I'm the woman who gave you an out when you were too weak to take it yourself. I'm the woman who deserves better than this falling apart mess you're turning into." The words hung in the air between them. "Damaged goods," Mark repeated. "You mean Deborah? The girl in the hospital who had you all twisted up, yes. Her. You were going to throw away everything for someone who might never recover. I did you a favor." Something cold settled in Mark's chest. "You planned this. From the beginning. Someone had to. You were drowning in guilt, Mark. I threw you a life raft. I loved her. You loved who she was before the accident. You have no idea who she would have been after." Cindy stepped closer, her voice dropping. "I gave you permission to move on, to choose yourself instead of martyrdom. You should be thanking me." Mark looked at the woman he'd married and felt nothing but emptiness. "Get out!" "Excuse me? Get out of this house. Find somewhere else to be." "This is my house too, Mark. We're married, remember? Or did that slip your mind while you're busy feeling sorry for yourself?" "I'll have divorce papers drawn up Monday morning." Cindy's eyes hardened. "Fine. and I'll take half of everything you have left, which, from what I'm hearing about your little business problems, won't be much." She walked out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle windows. Mark stood alone in a house that felt too big, too empty, too much like a monument to his own terrible choices. His phone sat silent on the table, no calls, no messages, no one left who wanted to talk to him. His best friend was gone. His brother was done with him. His mentor had washed his hands of him. His wife had revealed herself as a calculating stranger. And somewhere out there, Deborah Harrington Gordon was watching it all fall apart. Mark sank into a chair and put his head in his hands. 3 weeks ago, he'd had everything: a company, a beautiful home, a new wife, respect, friendship, family. Now he had nothing but questions and guilt and the growing certainty that he'd destroyed his life with his own cowardice. His phone rang. Unknown number. Mark answered without thinking. "Hello?" "I hope she was worth it." Deborah's voice. Cold, clear, devastating. "I hope every moment with her was worth what you're about to lose." The line went dead, and Mark Bracewell, sitting alone in his empty house, finally understood. This was just the beginning. Chapter 6. The Man Who Stayed. The environmental fundraiser was supposed to be another obligation. Deborah had attended 1,000 of these events, the kind where wealthy people gathered to feel good about writing checks, where networking mattered more than actual change, where everyone wore designer clothes and talked about making a difference while drinking champagne that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She'd come tonight only because her mother had insisted. "You can't hide forever," Sylviane had said. "The city needs to see you living, not just surviving." So Deborah had put on a dress that cost too much, done her makeup with precision, and driven to the venue with the same enthusiasm she'd bring to a dental appointment. She was standing in the back of the ballroom, barely listening to the speeches, when Scott Higgins took the stage. He looked uncomfortable up there, like someone who'd rather be anywhere else but had important things to say, and was going to say them anyway. His suit was nice, but not ostentatious. His tie slightly crooked, his hair just messy enough to suggest he'd been working all day and hadn't thought to check a mirror. When he started speaking, Deborah found herself actually listening. "I build buildings," Scott said. No preamble, no warm-up. "That's what architects do, but lately I've been thinking about what we're really building. Are we creating structures that serve communities, or are we just making monuments to money?" Someone in the front row shifted uncomfortably. Scott didn't seem to notice. "I lost my wife 3 years ago, cancer. And in those last months we spent a lot of time in hospitals, in treatment centers, in buildings that were designed without thinking about the people who'd be scared and sick inside them. Ugly fluorescent lights, beige walls, windows that didn't open. Whoever designed those spaces had never sat beside someone they loved and watched them fade." The room had gone quiet. "So now I try to build things that honor people. That remember, we're all going to have hard days, scary days, days when the space around us matters. I build community centers with big windows because natural light helps. I design affordable housing with green spaces because everyone deserves beauty. I create medical buildings where patients can see trees because hope matters." He paused, looked out at the audience of wealthy donors. "You're here tonight to write checks for environmental causes, and that's good. But I'm asking you to think bigger. Think about the environments we create every day. The buildings where people work, heal, live, die. We can make those spaces better. We should. Because how we treat the world around us reflects how we value the people in it." He stepped away from the podium without the usual closing platitudes, without asking for applause, just done. Deborah watched him leave the stage and disappear onto a terrace. Without quite meaning to, she followed. The terrace was quiet, overlooking the city, the noise of the fundraiser muffled behind glass doors. Scott was leaning on the railing, tie loosened, looking exhausted. "That was a good speech," Deborah said. He turned, surprised. Up close, she could see he was probably mid-30s with kind eyes and the sort of face that showed every emotion honestly. "Thanks. I'm terrible at those things. I always end up saying something that makes donors uncomfortable. You made them think. That's more valuable. Scott studied her for a moment. You're Deborah Harrington Gordon. She tensed. You know who I am. Everyone knows who you are. The slap heard across Manhattan, right? Social media had a field day. He held up a hand. I'm not judging. I actually respected it. Takes courage to do what you did. Most people think it was dramatic and inappropriate. Most people didn't get abandoned in a hospital by someone who promised forever. Scott's voice was gentle. My wife died 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months from diagnosis to gone. And in those 6 months, I learned exactly who actually shows up when things get hard. Spoiler, it's not as many people as you think. Deborah felt something in her chest loosen slightly. I'm sorry about your wife. I'm sorry about your accident, and about Mark Bracewell being a coward. Scott turned back to the city view. Look, I'm not great at small talk, so I'm just going to be direct. I know what happened to you. Not the gossip version, the real version. I know you got hurt. I know he left. I know he married someone else while you were still learning to walk. And I know you're probably standing out here because being around people who look at you with pity or curiosity is exhausting. What's your point? My point is that I get it. After Sarah died, everyone had opinions about my grief. Too much, too little, too long. Move on already. Nobody actually wanted to deal with the reality of it. They wanted me to perform recovery on their timeline. He looked at her. So I'm not going to do that to you. I'm not going to ask if you're okay or tell you everything happens for a reason or any of that nonsense. I'm just saying, if you want to sit with someone who doesn't need you to be anything other than here, I'm available. Deborah didn't know what to say. She'd built walls so carefully over the past months, had armored herself against sympathy and curiosity and judgment. But Scott wasn't offering any of those things. Why? She finally asked. Why what? Why would you want to sit with someone you don't know, someone whose drama is all over social media, someone who's... She gestured vaguely at herself. Broken. Scott's expression softened. You're not broken. You're healing. There's a difference. He pushed away from the railing. I'm getting coffee tomorrow at Morrison's on 5th, 9 a.m. If you show up, we can sit together and not talk about feelings or trauma or any of the heavy stuff. If you don't show up, no harm done. But the offer stands. He walked back inside, leaving Deborah alone on the terrace. She should have gone home. Should have dismissed the offer as pity disguised as kindness. Should have added Scott Higgins to the list of people who looked at her and saw a victim to be rescued. But something about the way he'd said, "You're not broken, you're healing," stayed with her. The next morning, Deborah found herself at Morrison's at 9 a.m. Scott was already there, 2 coffees on the table. He looked up when she walked in, smiled without surprise, and gestured to the chair across from him. You came. I did. Good. Fair warning. I don't know how to do this. Do what? Whatever this is, make friends? Have conversations with women I'm not related to or working with? Sarah was my person. After she died, I forgot how to connect with people without her there to smooth the way. Deborah sat down. I don't know how to trust people anymore, so we're both starting from zero. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee. It should have been awkward. It wasn't. Tell me about your work, Deborah finally said. So Scott did. He talked about buildings with the same passion he'd had in his speech, about creating spaces that mattered, about fighting developers who only cared about profit, about the community center he'd just designed for a neighborhood that had nothing. Deborah listened and found herself asking questions, real questions, engaging with someone's ideas instead of just going through social motions. What about you? Scott asked. What do you do? I worked at a gallery before. She paused. Now I'm figuring out what comes next. What do you want to come next? No one had asked her that. Everyone asked how she was feeling, if she was okay, if she needed anything. No one asked what she actually wanted. I want to matter again, Deborah said quietly. I want to be more than the girl who got hurt and the woman who got revenge. I want to build something that's mine. Then build it. It's not that simple. Why not? Because... She stopped. Why not? What was actually stopping her except fear? Scott leaned back in his chair. Sarah used to say that the hardest part of loss wasn't the grief. It was remembering how to want things again. How to imagine a future that looked nothing like the one you'd planned. Is that what you're doing? Imagining a new future? Every day. Some days are better than others. He smiled, and it was real. Today's a good day. They met for coffee the next day, and the day after that. Scott didn't push. Didn't ask about Mark or the slap or her family or the revenge everyone knew she was orchestrating. He talked about his work, asked about her opinions on art and architecture, told terrible jokes that somehow made her laugh. 2 weeks in, Deborah tried to scare him away. They were walking through Central Park when she stopped abruptly. You should know something about me. I'm not a good bet. I'm angry most of the time. I don't trust easily. I have nightmares about the accident. I'm probably going to push you away just to see if you'll leave. Scott looked at her calmly. Okay. Okay? That's it? What do you want me to say? That you're too damaged for friendship? That I can't handle complexity? He shrugged. Deborah, my wife died slowly over 6 months. I watched her fade, watched her hurt, held her hand while she cried because she knew she was leaving me. I learned more about pain in those months than most people learn in a lifetime. Your anger doesn't scare me. Your mistrust makes sense, and if you push me away, I'll just stand here and wait until you're done testing me. Why would you do that? Because you're worth it. The words were simple, honest, no grand declaration, no dramatic gesture, just fact. Deborah felt something crack in her chest, something that had been frozen since the hospital. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. Do what? Let someone in again. Believe someone will stay. Scott reached out and took her hand. His palm was warm, his grip steady. Then we'll figure it out together, one day at a time. And if you need to test me, test me. If you need space, take it. If you need to scream at me, scream. I'm not going anywhere. You promise? I promise. They stood there in Central Park, hand in hand, and Deborah let herself believe just a little that maybe some people did stay. Maybe some promises weren't lies. Maybe some men were strong enough to handle her truth. A month after they met, Scott kissed her. They were in his apartment, looking at building plans spread across his dining table, arguing good-naturedly about window placement. Deborah had said something sarcastic, Scott had laughed, and then suddenly he was looking at her differently. Can I kiss you? He asked. The question itself was its own answer. Mark had never asked, had just assumed, just taken, just moved forward with the confidence of someone who believed himself entitled. Scott waited for permission. Yes, Deborah said. The kiss was gentle, careful, full of question marks instead of demands. When they pulled apart, Deborah was crying. Too much? Scott asked, concerned. We can slow down. No, it's just, I forgot what it felt like to be asked, to have someone wait for my answer. Scott wiped away her tears with his thumb. Then I'll keep asking, about everything, always, because you deserve to have choices, Deborah. You deserve to be heard. She kissed him again, and this time it was less careful, more desperate, full of all the fear and hope she'd been carrying. Scott kissed her back with patience, with steadiness, with the promise of someone who wouldn't run when things got complicated. Later, lying on his couch, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat, Deborah said, I'm not over it. The betrayal, the anger, Mark. I didn't expect you to be. I'm going to have bad days. Days where I don't believe you'll stay. I know. And you're okay with that? Scott's hand moved through her hair, gentle and constant. Deborah, my wife died. I grieved her for 2 years. I still grieve her. Love doesn't erase pain, but it can exist alongside it. He tilted her chin up so she could see his eyes. I'm not asking you to be healed. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you while you heal. There's a difference. What if I never fully heal? Then you don't, but you'll still be worth standing beside. Deborah closed her eyes and let herself rest against him. For the first time since the accident, since the hospital, since the moment Mark had walked away, she felt something other than anger. She felt safe. And in that moment, lying in Scott Higgins' arms while somewhere across the city, Mark Bracewell's world continued to crumble, Deborah understood something crucial. Revenge was satisfying, but rebuilding was powerful. Mark had taught her about betrayal. Scott was teaching her about resilience, and she was learning that the best revenge wasn't destroying Mark's life. It was building a better one without him. Chapter 7. The Marriage of Greed. The credit card statement arrived on a Tuesday. Mark sat in his office, a smaller space now, after losing the headquarters building, after downsizing to what he could afford with dwindling investor support, and stared at numbers that didn't make sense. $200,000 in 1 month. Designer clothing stores, jewelry boutiques, a spa in the Hamptons that charged $3,000 for a weekend package, cash withdrawals in amounts that suggested Cindy was stockpiling money somewhere he couldn't track. Mark's company was bleeding. He'd lost 2 major clients in the past month. His second-in-command had quit to take a position at some company he'd never heard of. Found out later it was owned by a Harrington Gordon subsidiary. His patent licensing was under legal review, with lawyers telling him he'd probably lose. The bank had restructured his credit, cutting his limits and raising his rates, and Cindy was spending money like none of it mattered. He drove home early, the statement clutched in his hand. Cindy was in the living room with her laptop, video chatting with someone, laughing that bright, artificial laugh she used when performing for an audience. She saw Mark and ended the call abruptly. "You're home early. We need to talk." Mark put the statement on the coffee table. "What is this?" Cindy barely glanced at it. "My purchases, obviously." $200,000 in 1 month, Cindy. We talked about budgets. We talked about being careful while the company is struggling. Your company is struggling. I'm your wife. This is what wives of successful men do. But I'm not successful right now. Everything is falling apart and you're spending like we have unlimited resources. Cindy stood up, her face hardening. "That's not my problem, Mark. You're the businessman. You figure out how to make more money. That's your job. My job is to look good and represent us well in society." "Represent us?" "Cindy, nobody in society will even talk to me anymore. Every invitation gets declined. Every connection has gone cold. Whatever representation you think you're providing, it's not working. Maybe because you married damaged goods first and everyone remembers." The words hit like a slap. "Don't talk about Deborah that way." "Why not? It's true. You're still hung up on a woman who probably can't even walk properly while I'm here, whole and beautiful and everything you should want. But instead you're obsessing over money like some accountant." Mark stared at his wife and felt something inside him go cold. "How did you know she might have trouble walking?" "What?" "You said Deborah probably can't walk properly. How would you know that? You never met her." Cindy's eyes flickered with something, calculation, maybe fear, before her expression smoothed. "I heard things. People talk." "What people? I never told you details about her injuries." "Does it matter?" "It matters, because the only people who knew those details were her family and the hospital staff. So unless you've been stalking Deborah's medical records, which would be illegal or—" He stopped, pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. "You knew, from the beginning. You knew who she was, what happened to her, all of it." Cindy sighed like he was being tedious. "Of course I knew. I researched her when I first heard you were dating someone seriously." "You researched her. I research everyone. It's called being smart, Mark, and when I found out who Deborah Harrington Gordon really was, the family, the money, the connections, I knew you'd never survive that relationship." "What are you talking about?" Cindy moved closer, her voice dropping to something almost gentle. "Think about it. She was hiding who she was from you, letting you believe she was some gallery worker, some regular girl. Eventually, she would have revealed the truth. And then what? You would have realized how far beneath her you were. You would have spent your whole life feeling inferior, knowing you married into wealth instead of creating it yourself. That's not... I saved your ego, Mark. I gave you an out before the truth destroyed you. I made you see that what you had with Deborah was built on lies, and I offered you something real instead. Mark felt sick. You manipulated me. While Deborah was in the hospital, you poisoned my mind against her. I showed you reality. You wanted to see it. You wanted permission to leave because you were scared, and I gave it to you. Cindy's face was calm, clinical. You're welcome, by the way. For what? For saving you from wasting your life on someone who would have overshadowed you forever. Mark looked at the woman he'd married and saw her clearly for the first time. Not the understanding partner who'd helped him through a crisis, not the woman who'd seemed to really see him, a predator who'd identified weakness and exploited it. Get out, Mark said quietly. Excuse me? Get out of this house. I want a divorce. Cindy laughed, actually laughed. You want a divorce? Mark, I'm your wife. I have rights, and given how spectacularly your company is failing, I'll be entitled to at least half of whatever you have left, which honestly isn't as much as I was hoping for. Isn't as much as... Mark's voice shook. You married me for money. Of course I did. Why else would I marry someone who was clearly still in love with someone else? She picked up her laptop, perfectly composed. But you were available, vulnerable, and wealthy enough to solve my problems. I had gambling debts, Mark, serious ones. People I owed were getting impatient. You were my solution. You're insane. I'm practical. There's a difference. Cindy walked toward the stairs, then paused. Oh, and those offshore accounts you're probably wondering about? That's my exit strategy. I've been moving money since a month after the wedding. Insurance in case your business collapsed before I could take my cut legally. She went upstairs. Mark heard the bedroom door close. He stood alone in his living room, understanding finally, completely what he'd done. He'd abandoned a woman who loved him, truly loved him, who'd hidden her identity because she wanted him to love her for who she was, not what she represented, and married a con artist who'd seen him as nothing more than a transaction. Mark pulled out his laptop and opened his email, searched for messages from Cindy during those early weeks after the accident, found them. Just checking on you. I know this must be so hard. I'm here if you need someone to talk to. You don't have to go through this alone. Every message carefully worded to sound supportive while subtly undermining his relationship with Deborah. Every conversation designed to make him doubt, to make him afraid, to make leaving seem like the mature choice instead of cowardice. He opened his phone next, found text messages he'd forgotten about, Cindy sending him articles about traumatic brain injuries, about personality changes after accidents, about relationships that didn't survive crisis, all of it calculated, all of it manipulation, all of it designed to push him away from Deborah and towards Cindy, and he'd fallen for it, had let his fear overpower his love, had chosen the easy path over the right one. Mark's phone buzzed. Text from his lawyer. Client has filed divorce papers. She's asking for spousal support, property settlement, and compensation for emotional distress of marriage dissolution. This will get expensive. Of course it would. Mark looked around his house, the one Deborah had never seen, the one he'd bought with Cindy, the one that had never felt like home. Tomorrow he'd lose this too. Tomorrow he'd lose everything. His company was failing. His investments had abandoned him. His friends had turned away. His brother wouldn't speak to him. His mother could barely look at him, and his wife had revealed herself as someone who'd married him purely to escape her own debts. Everything Mark Bracewell had built, everything he'd been proud of, was crumbling, and it was his own fault. He could blame Cindy for manipulation, could blame the Harrington-Gordon family for their systematic destruction of his business, could blame circumstances and bad timing and fear. But at the core of everything was one simple truth. When Deborah had needed him most, Mark had run. He'd promised forever and delivered 5 weeks. He'd claimed to love her and couldn't handle seeing her hurt. He'd built a reputation as a self-made man, but couldn't survive the moment that required actual strength. Mark sat in his empty house and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd lost. Not the company or the money or the status. Those were just things. He'd lost the woman who'd loved him when he was nobody, who'd chosen him over her family name, who'd wanted him to know the real her before the complications. He'd lost Deborah, and no amount of success, no amount of money, no amount of anything would ever give her back. His phone rang. Unknown number again. Mark answered, already knowing who it would be. "She's showing you who I could have been," Deborah's voice said. Cold, clear, final. "Cindy is showing you what it looks like when someone marries you for what you can give them instead of who you are. I hope the lesson was worth the price." "Deborah, please." But she was already gone. Mark sat in his house and understood that this was his life now, this isolation, this regret, this consequence. And somewhere across the city, Deborah Harrington Gordon was building a new life with someone who'd been strong enough to stay, while Mark had nothing left except the knowledge that he'd destroyed everything with his own weakness. The divorce papers arrived the next morning, and Mark Bracewell, who'd once thought he had it all, signed them with hands that shook and a heart that had finally learned what loss really meant. Chapter 8. When Everything Falls. The email arrived at 6 a.m. on a Monday, like an execution scheduled for maximum impact. Mark read it 3 times, certain he was misunderstanding, but the words never changed. "Dear Mr. Bracewell, your lease for office space at Morrison Tower will not be renewed. Per our agreement, you have 30 days to vacate the premises. No exceptions will be made. Morrison Tower, his company headquarters for the past 3 years, the building where he'd closed his biggest deals, hired his best people, built the infrastructure that made everything else possible. Gone." Mark called the property management company immediately. Got transferred 4 times before reaching someone who would actually talk to him. "The building is owned by Morrison Property Group," the manager said, his voice professionally neutral. "And Morrison Property Group has been acquired by Ashford Holdings." "So? What does that have to do with my lease?" "Ashford Holdings is restructuring their portfolio. They've decided not to renew several commercial leases, including yours." "On what grounds?" "My lease has automatic renewal clauses, which can be overridden by new ownership during restructuring. It's all legal, Mr. Bracewell. I've sent you the relevant documentation." Mark hung up and immediately researched Ashford Holdings. Found the information buried in corporate filings, hidden behind layers of subsidiary companies and shell corporations. Ashford Holdings was owned by Harrington Gordon Capital. Of course it was. Mark spent the next week trying to find new office space, contacted every commercial real estate agent he knew, toured properties, submitted applications. Every single one came back rejected. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bracewell, but the building has decided to go in a different direction. Your application was very competitive, but we've chosen another tenant. Unfortunately, your business doesn't align with our building's portfolio strategy." The excuses varied. The result was always the same. By week 2, Mark's head of development, his most talented engineer, the woman who designed their core technology, gave notice. "I'm sorry, Mark. I've been offered an incredible position. Better pay, better resources, actual funding for my projects." "Where?" She'd hesitated. "Vertex Technologies." Mark had looked it up after she left. Vertex Technologies, owned by a Harrington Gordon subsidiary. His best engineer, poached by the family, systematically destroying him. He'd wanted to be angry, but he understood. Why stay on a sinking ship when you had a chance to survive? Week 3, the patent office called. "Mr. Bracewell, I'm calling regarding your technology patents. Our review has found issues with the licensing agreements from Ashford University. The university is claiming that certain aspects of your patents violate the terms of your original research agreement." "That's impossible. We've been over those agreements 100 times. Ashford University has brought in new legal counsel to review all technology transfer agreements. They're prepared to pursue legal action if necessary. Mark had looked up the new legal counsel, a firm that had represented Harrington Gordon interests for 30 years. His patents, the foundation of everything his company had built, were being challenged by a university that had suddenly, inexplicably, decided to review agreements that had been settled years ago. No coincidence, no accident, just another piece falling into place. By week 4, the banks started calling. Mr. Bracewell, we need to discuss your credit facilities. Given the changes in your business situation, we're implementing new terms. New terms meant higher interest rates, reduced credit limits, immediate repayment schedules that were designed to strangle cash flow. Every financial institution he'd worked with for years was suddenly treating him like a risk. Because he was a risk. Because the Harrington Gordons had made sure everyone knew he was a risk. Mark's final investor called on a Thursday afternoon. "I'm out, Mark, I'm sorry, but I can't keep throwing money into a company that's bleeding clients, losing office space, facing patent challenges, and getting frozen out by every bank in Manhattan. Give me time. I can turn this around." "With what? You have no headquarters, no funding, your best people are leaving, and nobody will work with you. Mark, you're done. And everyone knows why you're done. The Harrington Gordons. You abandoned their daughter in a hospital. What did you think would happen? That they'd just let it go? That family doesn't let anything go. They're making an example out of you, and the rest of us are smart enough not to stand in the way." The line went dead. Mark sat in his rapidly emptying office. Half his staff had already left, following the exodus of anyone with marketable skills, and watched his company die in real time. Emails from clients cancelling contracts, messages from partners dissolving agreements, notifications from service providers terminating arrangements. A cascade of failures, each one logical on its own, all of them together creating an avalanche that buried everything he'd built. His phone buzzed. Text from his mother. "Your brother moved to California. He didn't tell you because he didn't want you to know where. He asked me not to tell you either, but I think you deserve to know your own brother doesn't want you to have his address." Mark stared at that message until the words blurred. Daniel was gone. Not just metaphorically. Actually, physically gone to the other side of the country to get away from him. His mother's next text. "I don't know who you are anymore. Dad would be ashamed. I'm ashamed. Don't call for a while. I need time." Mark's hands shook. Put down the phone before he dropped it. His mother, the woman who'd raised him, who'd been so proud when he'd built his company, who'd told everyone her son was special, she couldn't look at him anymore. That night, Mark went home to the house he'd soon have to sell. Cindy's divorce settlement was taking half of everything, including property, and found the media had discovered the story. Articles everywhere. The billionaire who abandoned his injured fiancée. From tech success to social pariah. The Mark Bracewell story. How one bad decision destroyed a rising star. They had photos. Deborah in the hospital, leaked from somewhere. Probably her family wanted people to see what he'd done. Timeline of events. Interviews with people who knew them. The comment sections were brutal. He deserves everything that's happening. Imagine abandoning someone when they need you most. The Harrington Gordons are making him pay. Good. Mark read them all, masochistic in his need to understand how completely he'd fallen. Every comment was another nail, another condemnation, another confirmation that he'd become the villain in a story that would be told for years. His phone rang. James, his former best friend, calling for the first time in months. "Hello," Mark answered, hopeful despite himself. "I'm calling to tell you I'm getting married," James said, his voice formal. "And you're not invited. I wanted you to hear it from me instead of seeing it online." "James, please. I loved you like a brother. But what you did to Deborah, I can't have that in my life. My fiancé agrees. We don't want people at our wedding who don't understand what loyalty means. I made a mistake. You made a choice. You chose fear over love. You chose convenience over commitment. And now you're paying for it." James's voice softened slightly. "I hope you learn something from this, Mark. I hope you become better." But that better version of you isn't someone I need to know." The call ended. Mark looked around his house, soon to be sold, soon to be someone else's home, and felt the walls closing in. He'd lost everything: company, money, status, friends, family, respect. All of it gone because he'd been too afraid to stand beside someone who needed him. His doorbell rang. Mark answered to find a courier with papers. Divorce settlement finalized. Cindy had taken everything she could legally claim and some things that were questionable. The house would be sold, the proceeds split. What little was left after his company's failure would barely cover his debts. He was going to end up in a small apartment somewhere, working some mediocre job, starting over at 40 with nothing but regrets. Mark signed the papers with a hand that didn't shake anymore. He was beyond shaking, beyond feeling much of anything except a dull, persistent ache. His phone buzzed one more time. Social media notification. Someone had tagged him in a post. It was an engagement announcement. Scott Higgins and Deborah Harrington Gordon. The photo showed them on some beach, sunset behind them, Deborah laughing at something Scott was saying. She looked happy, genuinely, radiantly happy. Scott was looking at her like she was the only person in the world. The caption, "When you find someone who stays." Mark stared at that photo for a long time. At Deborah's smile, so different from the careful smiles she'd given him. At the way Scott held her, protective but not possessive. At the love that was obvious even through a screen. She'd moved on, found someone better, someone who didn't run when things got hard, and Mark was alone in a house he was losing, with a company that had failed, with relationships that had dissolved, with nothing left except the knowledge that he'd done this to himself. He thought about calling her, begging for forgiveness, trying to explain, but what would he say? That he'd been scared? That he'd let someone manipulate him because it was easier than being brave? That he was sorry? Sorry didn't fix anything. Sorry didn't undo the abandonment. Sorry didn't give back the 7 weeks she'd spent in a hospital calling for him while he was choosing someone else. Sorry was just a word that meant nothing when the damage was already done. Mark closed his laptop, turned off his phone, sat in the dark and finally fully understood what he'd lost. Not just Deborah, not just his life, but the man he'd thought he was, strong, self-made, successful. That man had been an illusion built on favorable circumstances. The real Mark Bracewell was the one who ran, who chose easy over right, who broke promises when they became inconvenient. And now the world knew it too. Tomorrow he'd start packing his office. Next week he'd list the house. Next month he'd move into whatever apartment he could afford. But tonight, Mark Bracewell sat in the ruins of his life and learned what it meant to lose everything by being too weak to fight for anything. Somewhere across the city, Deborah was probably celebrating her engagement with the man who'd been strong enough to stay. And Mark was alone with his choices, his regrets, and the devastating understanding that he had no one to blame but himself. Chapter 9. The Unraveling. The office was empty. Mark stood in the space that used to house 30 people, engineers, designers, support staff, the infrastructure of a company he'd spent years building, and listened to the echo of his footsteps on bare floors. They'd all left, every single one of them. Some had been poached by competitors, some had found positions at companies with better prospects, some had just walked away, unwilling to stay on a ship they knew was sinking. The last one to go had been Patricia, his assistant of 5 years. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bracewell," she'd said yesterday, not meeting his eyes. "I've been offered a position with better security." "Where?" "Sterling Consulting Group. Another Harrington Gordon subsidiary." "Of course." "I understand," Mark had said, because what else could he say? "Stay and watch your career die with mine." She'd left without looking back. Now Mark packed boxes alone. Company files that meant nothing anymore. Equipment that would be sold off to pay creditors. Awards from industry groups that had honored him back when he was someone worth honoring. His phone rang. His mother. Mark answered with something like hope. "Mum? I'm calling because I need to tell you something." Her voice was strained. "And I need you to just listen." Okay, your brother is getting married in December in California, and Mark, you're not invited. The words landed like physical blows. He asked me specifically to make sure you understood. No surprise appearance, no trying to come anyway. He wants to celebrate his future without being reminded of your failures. Mom, and I agree with him. Silence. Heavy and awful. What you did to that girl, his mother continued, I can't forgive. I thought I raised you better. I thought you understood loyalty, commitment, standing by people when life gets hard. But I was wrong, and I'm not sure I want to know the person you've become. I made a mistake. I know that. You made a choice. You keep calling it a mistake, like it was accidental, like you tripped and accidentally married someone else while the woman you claimed to love was in a hospital. But that's not what happened. You chose. And now you want everyone to feel sorry for you because you're facing consequences. I know what you want. You want us to forgive you without you actually changing. You want sympathy without accountability. But that's not how this works, Mark. That's not how any of this works. She hung up. Mark stood in his empty office and felt something break inside him that he hadn't known could still break. His mother, his family, gone. He sat on the floor, back against the wall, and let himself feel it all. The loneliness, the shame, the crushing weight of understanding that he'd destroyed every relationship that mattered. His phone buzzed, email notification, the real estate agent. House sale finalized, closing in 2 weeks, new apartment lease ready for signature. It's not what you're used to, but it's what you can afford. Mark opened the attachment. 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood he'd never heard of. Small, dark, nothing like the mansion he was leaving. But it was what failure bought, what consequences looked like. Another email. His lawyer, finalizing divorce details. Cindy had taken him for everything she could. The settlement was brutal but legal. She'd been smart about documentation, about protecting her interests. Even her gambling debts, which Mark had discovered and tried to use as leverage, hadn't mattered. She married you in good faith, her lawyer had argued. She shouldn't be penalized because your business failed. Never mind that she'd married him specifically to escape those debts. Never mind the manipulation and lies. In the end, she'd won. Last Mark heard, she was already dating someone else. Another wealthy target, another opportunity to exploit, and he'd been too blind to see it coming. Mark's phone rang again. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. Bracewell? Professional voice, female. I'm calling from the Manhattan Business Journal. We're running a piece on your company's dissolution and the circumstances surrounding it. I wanted to give you an opportunity to comment. I have nothing to say. We've spoken with several of your former employees. We have documentation of the systematic withdrawal of support from investors and partners. We know about the Harrington-Gordon family's involvement. This is your chance to tell your side. My side doesn't matter. Mr. Bracewell, I abandoned someone who trusted me. I married someone who manipulated me. I lost everything because I was too weak to handle a crisis. That's the story. Print whatever you want. He hung up. The article would come out regardless. Another nail, another public condemnation, another reminder that Mark Bracewell was the cautionary tale people told about weakness disguised as success. That evening, Mark drove past his old neighborhood, the one with the mansion he could no longer afford, and saw moving trucks outside, the new owners already taking possession, a family from the looks of it, kids running around, excited about their new home. They'd build memories there, happy ones probably. The house would become theirs, and whatever Mark had experienced in those rooms would fade like it had never existed. He kept driving, ended up outside James's apartment building. Sat in his car, staring up at windows he'd looked through 100 times back when they were friends. James was getting married and Mark wasn't invited, wasn't even wanted. The brother he'd chosen, the friendship he'd valued more than any other, was just over. Mark thought about going up, knocking on the door, trying one more time to explain, to apologize, to beg for understanding. But what was the point? Words didn't fix anything. Sorry didn't undo 7 weeks of abandonment. Regret didn't change the fact that when Deborah had needed him most, Mark had chosen comfort over courage. He drove to his soon-to-be former house and found himself pulling out his laptop, opening social media, looking at Deborah's profile. She'd made it public, probably wanted him to see photos of her and Scott, hiking trips, art galleries, dinner with friends, her smile genuine in every shot, her eyes clear and happy, Scott looking at her like she was precious, like he understood exactly what he had. Comments on their engagement photo: "You deserve all the happiness. Scott is a good man. We're so glad you found each other." This is what real love looks like. Mark scrolled through months of photos, watching Deborah rebuild her life without him, watching her laugh and thrive and become whole again with someone who'd been strong enough to stay. His phone buzzed, text from the movers, confirming pickup time for his belongings. The physical act of dismantling his life, scheduled and efficient. Mark closed his laptop and looked around the house one last time. Tried to remember what it had felt like to be happy here, to believe he'd made the right choice. He couldn't remember. Those feelings were gone, replaced by the hollow certainty that he'd traded everything real for an illusion. Tomorrow he'd sign the final papers, move into his small apartment, start whatever came next, with nothing but regrets and lessons learned too late. But tonight, Mark Bracewell sat in an empty house and finally wrote the letter he'd been avoiding for months. He addressed it to Deborah, not because he expected her to read it, not because he thought it would change anything, but because he needed to say the truth out loud, needed to acknowledge what he'd done without excuses or deflection. He wrote about his fear, about seeing her in that hospital bed and not being strong enough to handle it, about letting Cindy manipulate him because it was easier than being brave, about marrying her because guilt was crushing him and she offered an escape. He wrote about understanding now what he'd thrown away. Not just Deborah, but the version of himself he'd believed in, the self-made man, the strong leader, the loyal partner. All of it had been hollow. He wrote about watching her rebuild her life with Scott, about seeing her happy with someone who deserved her, about knowing he'd lost the only woman he'd ever really loved. And he wrote about accepting that there was no redemption arc coming, no moment where he'd make it right, no reconciliation, just consequences and learning to live with what he'd done. Mark sealed the letter and wrote Deborah's address on the envelope, put a stamp on it, walked outside and dropped it in the mailbox. It was done. He'd confessed, apologized, acknowledged everything. And it wouldn't matter, because sorry didn't undo pain. Regret didn't rebuild trust. Understanding came too late to save anything. Mark went back inside his empty house and sat in the dark, waiting for tomorrow, waiting for the next phase of a life he'd destroyed with his own weakness. Somewhere across Manhattan, Deborah was probably with Scott, planning their wedding, building their future, being loved by someone who understood what promises meant. And Mark was alone with his choices, his failures, and the devastating knowledge that he'd been given something precious and had been too afraid to keep it. The phone didn't ring. No one came. No last-minute revelation or second chance, just silence and darkness, and the long, slow process of learning to live with regret. Mark Bracewell had lost everything, and tomorrow he'd wake up and keep losing it, one piece at a time, until there was nothing left except the lesson: real men stay, weak men run, and he'd been the latter when it mattered most. Chapter 10. When Queens Rise. Deborah opened the letter on a Tuesday morning. She'd almost ignored it, had seen Mark's handwriting on the envelope and felt nothing but cold indifference. Scott had been making breakfast, had seen her holding it. "You don't have to read that," he'd said gently. But she wanted to, needed to see what Mark thought words could accomplish now. She read it standing at her kitchen counter, while Scott gave her space. Mark's confession was thorough. His fear when he saw her in the hospital, his weakness in letting Cindy manipulate him, his understanding that he'd destroyed everything that mattered, his acceptance that there was no redemption coming. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, wasn't begging for a second chance, just telling the truth finally. When Deborah finished, she stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of his words. Then she walked to the fireplace and lit the letter on fire, watched Mark's confession turn to ash, watched his truth disappear like it had never existed. Scott came to stand beside her. "Feel better?" "I don't feel anything, that's the point." Deborah turned from the flames. "He thinks confessing absolves him. It doesn't. He's learned his lesson too late for it to matter." "Do you wish things had been different?" Deborah thought about the woman she'd been when she loved Mark, younger, naive, willing to hide who she was for love. Thought about who she'd become, stronger, clearer, unbreakable. "No. Mark taught me what I didn't want. You taught me what I deserved. I'm grateful for both lessons." Scott kissed her forehead. "Good. Now come eat. We have a wedding to plan." The wedding was set for spring. Small ceremony, just family and real friends. No performance, no spectacle, just love. Deborah spent months planning it with Scott, and slowly the last pieces of anger faded. Not because Mark deserved forgiveness, but because holding on to rage gave him space in her life he hadn't earned. 3 months before the wedding, her mother called. Mark tried to reach out through business channels. "I had it blocked." "Good," Deborah said. "I have nothing to say to him. He's working some consulting job now, small apartment in Queens. Cindy took everything in the divorce. His mother won't return his calls. His brother moved across the country." Deborah listened without feeling anything. "He made his choices, and you made yours. I'm proud of you, darling, for rising, for becoming unbreakable." The words settled in Deborah's chest like truth. She was unbreakable, not because nothing had broken her. The accident had, Mark's abandonment had, 7 weeks in a hospital had shattered her. But she'd rebuilt, stronger, better. The wedding day was perfect. Spring sunshine, cherry blossoms in bloom. The ceremony in her family's private garden, where generations had married, where love had always been celebrated. Deborah wore a dress that showed her scars, the faint lines on her arms from the accident, proof she'd survived. She didn't hide them anymore. They were part of her story. When she walked down the aisle, Scott's face transformed, tears streaming, love so obvious it made her mother cry. The vows were simple, honest. "I promise to be strong when you need strength," Scott said. "I promise to stay when things get hard. I promise to love you not despite your scars, but because they're part of who you are." Deborah's vows were equally clear. "I promise to trust you with my truth. I promise to believe you when you say you'll stay. I promise to build a life with you that honors what we both survived to find each other." When they kissed, the crowd erupted, and Deborah felt, for the first time since the accident, completely whole. The reception was joyful, dancing and laughter and speeches from people who genuinely loved them. No pretense, just real connection. Lydia Trentworth gave a toast that silenced the room. "I've known Deborah since she was a child, watched her grow into a remarkable woman, and I watched her break when someone she trusted failed her." Lydia's voice rang clear. "But breaking isn't the end. Sometimes it's the beginning. Deborah didn't just survive. She rose. And Scott, you were wise enough to see that strength and patient enough to let her heal. That's what real men do, they stay." The applause was deafening. Later, her mother pulled Deborah aside. "Mark tried to come today. Security stopped him at the gate." Deborah felt nothing. "Did he say anything?" "Just that he wanted to congratulate you. Security turned him away." "Good." Her mother studied her face. "You really don't care anymore." "I care that I'm here with Scott. I care that I'm happy. I care that I learned what I deserved." Deborah squeezed her mother's hand. "But Mark, he's a stranger who taught me a lesson. Nothing more." "That's my girl." The night ended with Deborah and Scott dancing alone in the garden, everyone gone. The moon full, the air warm, everything possible. "What are you thinking?" Scott asked. "That I'm happy. Really, genuinely happy. Even with everything that happened?" Deborah looked at her arms, at the white lines catching moonlight. touched them gently, especially because of them. They remind me I survived, that I'm stronger than whatever tried to break me. Scott kissed her scarred skin. You're magnificent. And Deborah understood something profound. Mark had left because he couldn't handle seeing her broken. But broken wasn't destroyed, wounded wasn't weak. She'd been shattered, and she'd reformed into something better. Across the city, Mark probably lay awake in his small apartment, drowning in regret. But that was his story, his consequence. Deborah's story was about rising, about learning her worth, about demanding more than convenient love, about finding someone who understood that real commitment meant staying through hard parts, not just enjoying easy ones. I love you, she told Scott. I love you too. Always, forever, through everything. This time Deborah believed it, because some promises were real. Some men kept their word. Some love was strong enough to survive anything. 1 year after the wedding, Deborah stood in the foundation she'd built, for accident survivors, for people rebuilding after trauma, using her family's resources to create something meaningful, something that honored what she'd endured. Scott had designed the building, beautiful and functional and full of light, a place where people could heal without feeling trapped. They'd built something together, something that proved trauma didn't define you, how you rose from it did. That afternoon, someone mentioned seeing Mark. He works at some small consulting firm. Looks tired, older, like he's carrying the weight of the world. Deborah barely looked up. I hope he's learned something. Do you ever think about reaching out? Why would I? He doesn't deserve my energy. Deborah signed a document, decisive. Mark Bracewell was a chapter in my life. It's closed. I've moved on to better stories. That was the truth. Mark wasn't worth her anger, wasn't worth her time, wasn't worth any emotional energy. He was simply irrelevant. That evening, Deborah came home to Scott cooking dinner, music playing, their penthouse full of warmth and life. How was your day? Scott asked, kissing her. Perfect. Helped 3 new survivors get into the program. Made a real difference. That's my wife, changing the world one person at a time. They ate together, talked about their days, made plans for the weekend. Simple, beautiful, real. And Deborah understood what love was supposed to be. Not dramatic declarations, not grand gestures, not promises made over expensive wine. Just showing up, every day, through everything, being present, being strong, being real. Mark had promised forever and delivered 5 weeks. Scott had promised always and delivered every single day since. That night, lying in bed with Scott's arms around her, Deborah thought about who she'd been before the accident. Young, naive, willing to hide herself for love. She didn't miss that woman. The woman she'd become, scarred, strong, unbreakable, was better. What are you smiling about? Scott murmured, half asleep. Just thinking. About how everything that tried to break me made me stronger. That's because you're a queen. You rose from devastation and built an empire. You demanded your worth. You refused to settle. That's what queens do. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was a queen. Not because of her family name or wealth or power, but because she'd been broken and had chosen to rebuild herself into something magnificent. Deborah looked at her reflection in the darkened window, saw her scars, saw the strength in her eyes, saw the woman who'd survived and thrived and demanded more than convenient love. She smiled. Mark had thought leaving her would save him from difficulty, had thought marrying Cindy would give him an easier path, had thought weakness disguised as practicality was acceptable. He'd been wrong, and he'd paid the price with everything, but Deborah had learned the most important lesson. When you break a woman who knows her worth, she doesn't crumble. She rises. She becomes unbreakable. She builds an empire from the ashes of betrayal. And she finds someone who understands that scars aren't weaknesses. They're proof of survival, evidence of strength, marks of a warrior who fought back from devastation. Deborah Harrington Gordon had been abandoned when she needed someone most. She'd risen anyway, not despite the breaking, because of it. Because queens don't need saving. They save themselves, and then they build kingdoms that prove everyone who doubted them wrong. The end.